Welcome to the StoryWorks Reading Series, a podcast for readers, writers, and readers curious about writers. I'm your host, Alita Winternheimer. This month, StoryWorks Reading Series is thrilled to bring you Chris Hasara, writer, poet, farmer, and truck driver, reading his short story, Housekeeping. If you're enjoying the StoryWorks Reading Series, let the world know. Rate and review us wherever you get podcasts. Send word out to your friends. Let them know there is great writing happening wherever they get podcasts sent right to their devices. And if you're a writer, submit. We're looking for new pieces for 2022, and we would love to read your short stories and essays. Go to storyworkspodcast.com/submit. Now, here is Chris Hasara reading Housekeeping.
Ken leaned over too far and breathed in the smoke from the last of the legal bills. It was sweet and acrid and made him cough. He finished his beer in a long swallow, using the watered-down Pilsner to soothe his irritation. It was cold, wet, and generic, offering him the perfect level of anonymous relief. He grabbed another and tossed the empty into the fire. It clattered against the side of the old tire rim without breaking. Gina's yard art radio flyer, the mums carefully removed, sat next to him. It held a well-worn box marked File 451 and a small cooler. His chair groaned as he bent, rummaging around in the box until he came up with a couple of rags. He took care not to let the wetter stains stick in the dirt on his hands. He continued feeding the fire. "Who would have thought the old boy had so much blood?" he said to nobody, then let out a small, sad sound that could have been a laugh. He watched as the tongues of flame first licked, then consumed each scrap of terry cloth. There were plenty more left inside yet to burn. This would take up the afternoon. The last swallow of beer turned bitter in his mouth. This time, when he threw in his empty bottle, it shattered against the others. He'd lost count of how many he'd had. He needed to pace himself. He'd tasted more beer in the past week than he had in the entirety of his marriage, but he was still a relative lightweight, despite his extra pounds. It would be a bad idea to get buzzed too quick, and a day like this, when he was overworked and overheated, was made for bad decisions. More importantly, he'd only been able to fit 6 in the cooler. He smiled a bitter grin at the next folder. It was full of pictures. On top was the glossy portrait of their wedding. Gina had been a tyrannical bitch before the ceremony, but she'd also been gorgeous. She could always turn it on for the camera. His throat tightened, thinking about her most recent set of pictures, the ones on the unmarked thumb drive. He used the corner of the photo to dig some dirt out from beneath his fingernail before flipping the picture into the fire. He needed more to drink. He grunted when his hand reached the bottom of the cooler without finding a bottle. "So much for pacing myself." He shrugged, picked out the next photo, and gave it a lazy flick. It spun in a tight horizontal circle until it caught the updraft from the flames. It tumbled in the air, showing flashes of a happy couple at a beach. Ken couldn't remember the trip and didn't care to try. He was trying to remember how many bottles of beer he'd left in the fridge. The picture began to darken before it touched down on the pyre, curling in around the happy couple. He was taken in by its slow dance before a sudden shift in the air currents dropped it like a hanged man, and he was left peering at the house. With its whitewashed walls, it stood out in the sun, shining through the thickets of trees that surrounded the property. Even at this distance, he could see the dark scar of freshly turned dirt at the back corner of the house. Seeing it, whole and all, felt like an answer. Everything he owned in the world, his half of their life, had been split between his new apartment and the storage unit he'd been forced to get to handle the overflow. Technically, the house and everything with it was hers at noon, as per the judge's decree. He had just under 20 hours of de facto home ownership. Ken heaved himself out of the chair. He couldn't just sit staring at the fire, drying out in the heat, stewing over wasted years. He tossed the rest of the pictures, folder and all, into the fire without looking to see if they caught. He started back to the house to find more to drink. It was a long, hot walk under the afternoon sun. The trees offered scant shade. They were pale imitations of the old-growth behemoths that encircled the Victorian-style home. She'd loved the fire pit, eventually. They'd spent many nights under the stars making up for the arguments they'd had about putting it in. Like so many things, it belonged in a file marked Happy Days. I'm just like the friggin' Fonz. He wiped at the sweat running into his eye, except the Fonz was always cool. His voice, too loud in the humidity, bounced off the surrounding trees. The woods said nothing in return, but in their silent regard, he felt commiseration. The Arctic blast of conditioned air washed over Ken as soon as he opened the door. Compared to the heat outside, it felt cool enough to hang meat. He stepped through and into the remarkably unscarred kitchen. Seeing the complete and usable, nearly normal room brought to mind all that was missing. Fully half of the contents of the entire house had been removed because Gina hadn't been able to keep it in her pants. The seething cauldron of hurt and outrage that filled his heart threatened to bubble over again for a moment, sending up a toxic cloud into his brain. He took in a deep breath and let it out slowly, touching each of the fingers of his right hand with his thumb as he did. He couldn't afford to lose his cool. Hot blood had already done enough damage. The shape on the floor in the den was proof enough of that. He wanted something to scrub out the stain of his failed happily ever after. His eyes fell on the cabinet, Gina's secret stash beneath the sink. Gina had strong opinions about the kind of man who would like mixed drinks, so Ken had learned to enjoy beer. I'm not going to drink that floofy shit, she told him once when discussing margaritas and mimosas. Gina had scoffed, actually scoffed, when offered a chance at a winery tour. When she wanted to tie one on, she'd drink gin, straight from the bottle, full tilt boogie until she or the bottle was finished. It was her only vice, aside from the adultery. When he opened the door, Ken was reminded that he wasn't the last person to put Gina's drink away for her. The pint bottle was there, along with a fifth of Fireball and a half-gallon of pure grain alcohol. Its clear liquid magnified the fire extinguisher behind, mixing with the light from the overhead fluorescents, making the bottle shine like a warning beacon. Seeing the invading booze tucked away by strange hands in such a familiar manner hit Ken like a physical blow in the solar plexus. It was a reminder of just how badly everything had gone. He staggered, his hand on the countertop the only thing keeping him from falling to his knees. The bubbling cauldron boiled over. Without thinking any higher than his reptile brain, Ken grabbed the bottle of gin and whirled, hurling it through the open kitchen doorway, through the dining room, and into the den on the far side. It crashed into the mantel above the fireplace, exploding in a sunburst of juniper wetness. The cement mantelstone was stained in radiating streaks when the glass shattered. Ken stared in mute fascination at the pattern, watching as the liquor dripped noisily to the brick hearth. The impact satisfied a primal itch. It was followed by a wave of shame. Glass and alcohol littered the wall and floor of the den. He'd have to clean that. He couldn't leave the house a mess. Ken returned to the undersink storage. He grabbed the whiskey and, on a whim, stretched in for the Everclear. His lower back spasmed as he reached. No doubt he'd tweaked something recently, and making a throw like that was one exertion too many. He righted himself, feeling another muscular tug from his lower back. It was wild and urgent, forcing him to drop the drinks on the counter with a clatter and clutch with frantic abandon at the pain. It passed before he could massage it away, but left behind the ghost of spasms yet to come. Ken surveyed the clutter. He'd never had a Fireball before, but the dancing devil on the bottle fit his mood. He removed the cap, releasing an autumn breeze, and took a hesitant sip. The rush of cinnamon was shocking, and he began to cough before he'd fully disengaged from the bottle. He had never been good at drinking hard liquor, and he was definitely out of practice. Eventually, his coughing smoothed into extended throat clearing. Cold heat blossomed within as the drink filled him like molten peace. He looked at the mess he'd made through his watery eyes. Should have used a sippy cup, he said to the half-empty house. That struck him as funny, so he laughed. It started as a series of disjointed barks that rose into the full belly roar comedians kill for. It was liberating. He could feel tears rolling down his cheeks, but didn't care. He followed it up with a second swig from the fifth, which resulted in more coughing that morphed into more laughter. As he calmed, the strong smell of gin filtered in from the den. Ken's face curled up in revulsion. It was just like her to continue to contaminate the house with her stink. He took the whiskey over to the fireplace, stepping over the mess he'd made next to the tumbled recliner. He considered how to cover the smell of the gin when an idea struck him. He took a drink of the fireball, but instead of swallowing, he sprayed it out through his teeth. He took a step back, giving the room an exploratory sniff. The cinnamon and juniper gave birth to something pleasantly autumnal. He righted the fallen recliner and settled into it with the drink. The chair was twin to the one he'd put in storage, except in how it still felt like her, even if it did smell a bit of bleach. His stomach twisted, thinking of her and the seat's last occupant. Ken focused on the empty fireplace, refusing to acknowledge the crumpled form beside him. He was reluctant to return to the heat outside. There had been enough of that already, and resting eased his back. He considered the fire he'd left burning and the papers left to go. If he moved the burning inside, then he might be able to stay cool while he handled the cleanup. It would even save time and trips with the wagon. True, he'd never burned indoors, but how hard could it be to make fire in a brick hole? Back inside, he built the fire with deliberate care, working slow to compensate for his lack of coordination. He was almost out of papers to burn, so he'd left the cooler next to the wood pile and refilled the space with logs. Most of the wood was well seasoned, and with the papers to kindle, he had the fire roaring in no time. He tried to set the flue, but after fiddling with the damper chain without knowing which way was right, he gave up and backed away from the heat. Ken set a full folder of tax papers and pay stubs directly atop the flaming logs before using a second empty folder to sweep up the remains of the gin bottle. He tossed those into the fire atop the taxes. The papers caught at once, the ink and glass lending the flames iridescent shades of blue and green. He tossed the thumb drive into the blaze, curling his nose at the acrid tang of burnt plastic. He settled back into the recliner to watch, the fireball resting in his lap like a contented cat. The hollowness of the room clawed at his thoughts. It wasn't as empty as it should be, and it was too empty by half. He tried to choke it down with the whiskey, using the sweet amber booze as a salve against painful memories. He wanted solace, longed for the alcoholic anesthetic of apathy. He applied his medicine liberally. He slipped into a resigned stupor, marinating in self-pity. His eyes wandered the room, lighting on different points where some artifact of the past should have been. Eventually, inevitably, they fell on the shape next to the chair. Her face was still blue from lack of oxygen, a contrast to the long fall of chestnut hair that framed her wide, smoke-gray eyes. He sipped at the bottle, not so much as a tickle in his throat now, and stared at his wife. It should have been funny, ironic at the very least, considering he hadn't lifted a finger toward her. It was no wonder she looked surprised. Nobody expects to get their hair caught in the footstool of a recliner and choke the way she did. He shifted his regard to the damned spot that he hadn't quite been able to get out of the floor. That had been his doing. He took another pull through a joyless grin. He dragged his eyes away from the faint outline and glared back at the stone and flame. He considered the work that lay ahead. The hole outside needed tending, but so did the fire. He'd go back out just before dark and take his house. He'd go out back just before dark and take his house guests to see his landscaping project. He let out a single snort to stand in place of a laugh and stood to get to work. By his best guess, he had 3 hours left to burn away. He stood, staggered, set the bottle down in the chair, and began the work of cleaning out the remnants of his marriage. He started by heaving one of the larger towels into the fireplace. He continued this way, teetering back and forth from the utility sink in the laundry room to the fire. He carried the evidence a piece at a time, trying to be thorough. When he stepped back to observe his work, all he saw was smoke. He was so stupid. In his haste, he nearly smothered the fire. He tossed the last of the logs on top, thinking to force the rags down onto the hottest parts. What he got for his efforts was thicker, darker, more acrid smoke. The flames were nowhere in evidence. This wouldn't do. Fire was supposed to be nature's perfect stain remover. Instead of a clean slate, all he had to build on was smoke. Angry and desperate, Ken spun in a circle, looking for the fire poker before remembering he'd wrapped it up with. He hated not knowing what to call the man. The guy had done him the favor of smothering Gina. It didn't seem right not to give the guy a name. Ken settled on Trevor. He coughed on the smoke filling the room and came back to the problem at hand, the fire. His eyes landed on the bottle of Everclear he'd left on the counter. He reeled into the kitchen and snatched up the grain alcohol, fumbling for the lighter he'd used when he first set everything going. He spun, one hand in his pocket, and lost his balance. He came down hard on his knee in a half split, cradling the bottle of Everclear with one arm. He came to rest on his side, eye level with the bottom of the recliner. Poking from beneath was the blue Bic lighter he'd been looking for. It must have fallen out while he lounged. He gave it the finger. He intended to use the grain alcohol like lighter fluid, but seeing the lighter triggered a memory of their honeymoon in New Orleans. There had been a street performer doing a fire swallowing act, blowing great gouts of flame into the night. It had been exhilarating. The excitement had followed them all the way to the hotel, where they'd made love with the sounds of the endless party going on below. He could use that same fire technique here, but he needed to hurry before all the heat left the floundering blaze. He crawled his way back, refusing to meet Gina's mute and staring eyes. He used the recliner to pull himself up and toppled it all over again, blocking her vacant expression. Sweat poured down his face so thick he could taste it, salty and rich, and thought for the first time in his life that he might be dangerously out of shape. The thought came and went, ephemeral as smoke. The fire was the thing, and he now had the means to literally breathe life back into it. He raised the lighter halfway to his face and took a swig. He spit it out immediately. It was like holding a mouthful of angry bees. He spat twice, ignored the puddle he'd sprayed on the floor in front of the fireplace, and tried again. This time, when he held the lighter up to his mouth, he sprayed the caustic fluid in a stream directly onto the lighter, where it promptly extinguished the flame. In a fit of pique and frustration, he tried pouring the contents directly onto the towels. All he got was more smoke and bilious vapors that clung to the ground. He studied the bottle. There was enough for one more mouthful. He tried to remember exactly how the fire swallower had done it. He pursed his lips and blew the alcohol out like a raspberry. The aerosol caught, third time's being charmed, and he sprayed it directly into the stack. Just before the moment of ignition, Ken had a flicker of doubt. I'm too close, he thought. Before he felt the heat, his eyebrows were already gone. Ken watched the atomized fire touch with wide eyes. His mind slowed, letting him take in the full force of the explosion. In an eternal fraction of a second, he watched the blaze spread like a hungry flood. In it, he saw every one of his past sins laid bare. It was as if some part of his brain thought that this was the end and a reckoning had come due. The heat rolled through the room, hot and angry, and Ken cringed away from its judgment. It knew his darkest failings, and it found him wanting. It shed its terrible light on the dark smudges of unwashable dirt ground into the whorls and ridges of his palm. Ken tried to back away, to flee, but stumbled on the wagon, sending it careening into the darker recesses of the house. He fought for balance and lost, rolling over the top of the fallen recliner. The last thing he saw, before coming to rest on the other side of the makeshift bunker, was the expression on Gina's face, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth stuck in a permanent O of surprise. He struck his head and found the dark oblivion he'd been seeking. Ken woke to pain. Every part of him, body and soul, cried out at his sudden return to consciousness. The heat of the room licked at his seared skin. He put a hand to his face, the greatest source of pain, and prodded. It was tight and tender, but he didn't feel any blistering. He looked around for anything he could use to cover his tortured flesh. The roaring sound of a wind-fueled avalanche filled the room. Ken couldn't see anything through the haze in the air. He didn't know how long he'd been out, but guessed if he hadn't been prone behind the chair, the smoke might have gotten him before he ever woke up. It pressed in on him from all sides, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. In a panic, Ken stood to run. Standing was a mistake. His head swam from the knock he'd taken. His body ached and protested at every move. One breath was all he managed before he crashed back to his knees and retched. Ken crawled toward the dining room. He kept his head down as he moved, keeping his breathing as shallow as he could, focusing on the infinite pattern of the uniform hardwood flooring. He stopped when he rammed his shoulder into the doorway of the kitchen. He made his way around the wall and felt the temperature drop almost at once. The air was still near useless, but would have to do. He needed time to think. A thrill of revelation rushed over him. With the raging fire and crowding smoke, he could do things differently. And why not? The last 24 hours had been nothing but disrupted plans and improvised housekeeping. The hole was already dug. He'd done that the night before. Didn't he have the aching back to prove it? He could fill it with one body instead of two. What he couldn't do was deliberate any longer. He found his way through the heat and smoke of the den and into the living room where he'd left Trevor, already wrapped in the rug. He dragged the carpet roll by one corner, moving it in lurch steps, maybe a foot or two at a time. Each breath he took let the murderous smoke coat his lungs. He almost tripped over Gina as he worked his way past. By the time he reached the door, he thought he might be dying. He could feel his pulse in his eyes. His lower back sent a shivering jolt all the way to his hairline with every move. His already sore and overworked hands cried out for mercy. Still, he hitched his gruesome houseguest out the door. Ken stopped to breathe once he reached the fresh air. He swayed at the naked richness he took in with every lungful. He stood to stretch his back and had to resume his stooped position. His muscles refused to tolerate such an abrupt return to normal. The hole was only a short distance away. He returned to his grunting struggle, not stopping until he tripped over the shovel he'd left lying on the ground. Ken swore. He let out a stream loud and long and guttural enough that his throat began to ache from the force of the words. He dropped the corner he'd been tugging when he started to stumble. Now he groped for it, desperate for anything that would keep him from tumbling backward into the hole. The shovel fell in instead, kicked by one scrambling foot, and Ken was able to keep himself topside. He looked back at the house, but didn't see any troubling smoke yet. That might mean he had just a little more time. If the fire wasn't too far out of control, he could even go back inside and take care of Gina. That thought shocked him with its brutal efficiency, and he took a second to search his conscience. He didn't think he was heartless, as a general rule, but he was surprised to discover how starkly pragmatic survival had made his thoughts. Buoyed by the hope that he could still salvage the situation, Ken repositioned himself to push. He got to his knees and started to roll Trevor in his cheater burrito. He strained. The body moved grudgingly, inches or less at a time, but forward nonetheless. Finally, near the edge, Ken gave a great heaving lunge. He felt a slippery loosening just above his hip. He imagined he heard something down low in his internal support structure snap and give way. He twisted and writhed, his hands shifting on the almost frictionless underside of the rug. Momentum carried him forward, his bulk tipping over top the body, and he flipped over and down into the hole. Just before he glided free of the corpse, his foot snagged. He strained his bloodshot eyes, looking up between his legs to see what had caught him. One of Trevor's hands had slipped out of the unraveling rug, tangling Ken's shoelace around the watch. Ken tried to pull, to inchworm, to claw, and to roll. He used every move he had left in his arsenal to try to dislodge his lace, but only succeeded in dragging the body closer to the tipping point. That was fine with Ken. If it fell in the hole, that's where he wanted it anyway. Besides, it would give him something else to stand on to climb out. He increased the ferocity of his motion. The body slid out of the wrapping. Ken fell first, landing face up on a shovel-shaped lump. Sharp pain at the base of his neck raced like electricity to the extreme edges of his body. Before he could so much as twitch, Trevor came down on top of him, pants still down around his ankles. The body landed against Ken's face, loose and impossibly heavy, the center of gravity squarely over the point of the shovel digging into Ken's back. There was a flash of stabbing pain, faster than memory could record, and then Ken felt nothing. Ken pushed at the body on top of him, but nothing moved. No part of him moved. The weight that pushed down on him was as impossible as it was ubiquitous. With his first breath, he tasted Trevor's cologne. He gagged and tried to find air. He managed to turn, but there was no reservoir of air to be found. He was grateful for the fact of his own mobility, but what air he drew in was stale and earthy. It reminded him of potatoes. His next breath did not come easy. Once he got it, he tried to hold on to it. Beneath the man-slut's corpse, the only thing more precious than air was light. Dirt must have followed the body down because Ken couldn't even make out the color of the shirt pressed into his eyes. He'd never understood how complete darkness could be. He screamed, but it was a muted whimpering sound. That human weight pressed down with every exhale, making the next harder. The blankness of sensation below the level of his face was the most maddening part to Ken. It was like trying to take a drink after getting dental work done. That curious hole in sensation. But this was more. A crazy blank nothingness that extended to the entire world south of his chin. At least he couldn't feel the naked thighs that pressed against him. He could feel the effectiveness of each breath getting smaller, even if he couldn't feel the actual smallness of each breath. His thoughts grew spongy. He was tired, so very tired. It had been a long night and day. If he could rest just for a short while, he was sure he could gather his thoughts. If he'd been able to laugh at this stupid joke of a situation, he would have. He felt like he was dying, and there was nothing funny about that. Except there was. If Ken died, then Trevor might well be the first post-mortem serial killer. Ken tried to cough out a laugh, but only wheezed another short, precious second of oxygen away. He gave in to graying thoughts and vacant feelings. His last flicker of hope was the fire. If he could keep breathing long enough, someone was bound to see the smoke. Surely they would find him. Wouldn't they? He didn't care what it looked like. He just wanted air. He just wanted something clean to breathe.
That was Chris Hasara reading his short story, Housekeeping. Chris is a father of 4 and husband of 1 in northern Indiana. He studied creative writing while pursuing a degree in philosophy from Western Kentucky University. He has applied that education to a successful career as a truck driver and farmer, but continues to write whenever time and space allow. He has had short stories and poems published in the anthology From the Edge of the Prairie, as well as having poems published in recent volumes of the Last Stanza Poetry Journal. He is a member of the Indiana Poetry Society and has been published in Volume 6 of the Society's book, Ink to Paper. So welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for bringing your story to the reading series.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be a part of this.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned in your bio that you write when time and space allow. I think every writer can relate to that. So few of us get to be full-time writers. Can you give us a glimpse into your writing life and how you manage to make art with such a busy household and 2 careers?
Yes, when working on the farm, I do a lot of truck driving for the farm. And when I'm sitting in line waiting to dump a load of corn or something, I try to squeeze in just a couple of minutes at a time for a story. And all the characters, all the stories, they all live in my head, just like they would, I'm sure, like all of us, it's never too far from the surface. If you scratch us just deep enough, there's a whole wealth of people hiding in our brains that we're not even necessarily aware of. And when I get just a couple of seconds at a time, I might hammer out a couple of sentences at a time. It's actually made it so where in November is one of the busiest times on the farm, always busy with the harvest and everything else. And I still try to tackle the NaNoWriMo challenge, and I've managed to succeed for the past 7 years now.
Oh my gosh.
Where I successful. Well, it's not always been good work, but I got the words done just the same.
That is impressive. And NaNoWriMo is all about the word count, right? It's first draft material. Yeah. And then, So how do you write while driving and such, 2 sentences at a time, are you using dictation? Do you record it, or do you keep a little notebook, or what?
Well, I use my phone for everything that I do. So I have Word on the phone, and I pop that up, and I have a Bluetooth keyboard that I just set across the steering wheel and click away. And sometimes if there's a delay somewhere, I'll get a half an hour to write, and I can get, it's surprising how many words you can get when you just kind of stumble in. And I don't know if it's just a flavor of desperation in trying to get stuff crammed in such a short amount of time, but it shortcuts that getting into a flow state.
Yes.
So I can actually, like, sometimes hammer out 100, 200, 300 words in 20 minutes.
Wow.
And other times I'll struggle for half an hour to get 10.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's impressive. I think it's such a great reminder to us as well to make good use of the time. We have so many people think, oh, I can't do anything if I only have 10 minutes, right? But if you set yourself up to do something, you can do a lot. Keeping that keyboard in your truck with you is fantastic. It makes me want to put Word on my phone right everywhere. Yeah. So do you consider yourself more of a poet or a prose writer?
I definitely consider myself more of a poet. Like, I feel comfortable with the name poet for myself. I struggle labeling myself as a writer, even though I spend much more time writing prose, working at it. But poetry has always come somewhat easily for me. Like, it's a thing that I understand, but at a deep and internal level. So yeah, I definitely consider myself more of a poet.
Interesting. So how does being a poet affect your writing prose? Does it shift your process at all, or the way you use language, do you think?
Well, it definitely affects the way I use language. I have to watch sometimes, because sometimes it's always good to find that clever turn of phrase, but unfortunately some of the things that would be clever in a poem just look really pretentious in a story. And I definitely want to avoid doing that. I don't want to I don't want to become a cliched writer because I tried to do too much. And it's something that I'll pick out of other works that I'm reading where the writer got a little too clever, and I'm like, come on.
Right. Yes. Yeah. We have that phrase, purple prose, but nobody says purple poetry, right?
Right.
like you get to be lyrical and rhyming and imagistic in your poetry in a way that I suppose could push an envelope in prose writing.
Yeah, I've definitely found myself doing it, and I've learned with time to back off of it. But I can still sneak in little phrases, like in the story I just read. One of my favorites was having the bottle sitting in his lap like a contented cat. I just liked that. It was a nice, colorful phrase, but it wasn't too much. And that's the balance that I'm always trying to find.
Definitely. Yes. Yeah. I love that. That is a great image. It says so much about your character, Ken, and the way he's relating to that bottle in the moment, and yet it's shifting that perspective to the cat, the bottle being like the cat to the inanimate object. Yeah, I like that. Last month on the reading series, I spoke with Robert James Russell about the Midwestern voice. And then the month before him, Jonathan Haidt, the essayist, we spoke about land, trees, environmental writing. At the beginning of the year, I read a story set in Minnesota, and then S.A. Walter's piece was set in North Dakota. And here you are in Indiana, and you're a farmer. There seems to be a theme coming up this year unintentionally. So what is your take on this region and its landscape and how it affects us as writers and our writing voice?
I listened to the reading series from the last month, and thoroughly enjoyed the story, by the way, also. And I started thinking about the Midwest voice in potential anticipation of this question.
Okay.
And mostly I had to absolutely 100% agree. because before moving back up to where I live now, I lived in Kentucky for a while I was going to school down there. And the writers that I knew from that area wrote, it was a slightly different voice. There's much more about the land that filters into more dynamic land. Like here where I live, it's pretty flat, like most of the Midwest. And so the land itself doesn't factor in as much to, like, it doesn't become so much of a character. Mm-hmm. Now, if like maybe something interesting like woods or a swamp or something like that, something that stood out against the flat rolling hills of corn and beans, and then more corn and beans and maybe a little more corn. It has its effect, but it has its effect in the way that it doesn't. Like, yeah.
Interesting. I want you to say more about that. And you know, as you were speaking, I was thinking about what Robert James Russell was saying about Nebraska and it being the plains, and how different that is from somewhere like Minnesota or Michigan, where you have forests and, you know, a lot more water. And we do have a flatter region to the west of Minnesota, in the western part of Minnesota, but then we've got bluffs and hills in the eastern and the northern part. So what about your landscape? Can you go into that a little more, what you just said?
Sure. Like, for instance, like around where I live, it's mostly reclaimed marshland. It's where the Kankakee River it used to be a big marsh, and it's been drained and ditched. So the Kankakee is basically somebody's drainage ditch at this point in time. So it used to be a very sprawling landscape, and the cranes, they come over through Nebraska, and they come through my backyard, and cool. it's fun to watch them. It's like having dinosaurs show up at certain times of the year, but it does affect. It affects the way I think about things, because seeing that migratory process, that's part of my particular area, part of my region, that it lends me to think about the transitory nature of everything around me, even though, like, I can see in any direction for 20 miles easily. It's there's still that slightly fleeting thing. So it plays into the subconscious way that I approach the story. Like everything, when I begin a story, I always feel like I can see straight through to where I'm looking, and then there's everything else just comes in like driving at night now with headlights.
Right.
But it seems clear at first.
Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting. And you know, I live in a region where you can't see the forest for the trees. You know, our landscape is always interrupted. Do you find that your characters share your sensibility and relationship to the land? You know, do you like to write characters that are also of this place and of similar relationships?
Yeah, I definitely do like to write characters, not even so much from this place where I live now, but when I cast my mind towards these stories, I tend to cast my mind a little bit further north. I grew up in Gary, Indiana, and it's an urban area, and it's very close houses, very different from the area where I live now, very rural. And when I cast my mind to the stories, the characters that pop up are almost always characters that live in that area. They live in that setting. And so a lot of my stories I just put them there because it's easier. Because trying to put a city person into a country setting, there's a difference. I know there's a difference because I found out there's a difference through my own life. So it would come across, if I didn't write the character as awkward, then it would come across as false.
Wow, that's interesting. Huh. I feel like we could talk about this for hours, but I want us to get into the story. So one of the things that makes a story is the minutia, the little things that the author brings to life. You've got this great line: early on when Ken's anger and disappointment is just starting to become clear to the reader. You write, he used the corner of the photo to dig some dirt out from beneath his fingernail before flipping the picture into the fire. And then later in the story, at the end, what air he drew in was stale and earthy. It reminded him of potatoes. I just love these moments. There are many of them throughout this story. Are you consciously crafting them when you write, or do you find that they just flow as part of the narrative process, maybe your poetry coming to bear on this narrative?
It's kind of a combination of the two things, because I want, like in the case with the picture and digging the dirt out from his fingernails, I wanted to show that he had dirty fingernails, and the way to do it just kind of flowed from that, because it was a natural thing that a person might do. And again, with the smell of potatoes, because that's what dirt smells like to me. When I get around too much dirt, it just reminds me of potatoes. So I figured, why not? It seemed a human thing. Put it in there.
Yeah, yeah, and it is so human. And it's interesting you say that to you, dirt just smells like potatoes. And for me, that was revelatory. That was so fresh. I was like, oh yeah, of course it does. How, that's awesome. And when he, used the photo on his fingernails, you say you wanted to show his fingernails were dirty, which is such a writer as architect. We're crafting the story. What am I showing? How am I going to show it? What's effective? And as a reader, it struck me how little regard he had for the photo and the person in it, and that it was almost insulting to the wife. And so I was working on multiple levels there. Yeah. You are also, besides not being our first Midwestern writer, you are not the first this year to have a single character on the page. Susan Walter's Blackbart, that is primarily a single character. Laura James in Stuck, her protagonist is going to rendezvous with a lover, but they're ships who pass in the night. Even in last month's Recreation, Robert James Russell's character is with her husband, but they never interact in the story. She's observing him. And, as with the Midwestern thing, I didn't plan this. It just sort of happened that this is what is crossing my desk. Now, what made you decide to write a single character story and to give Ken nobody or nobody living to interact with?
Well, it all bloomed from the moment of inspiration. We were moving into a different house, and in the process of moving, there were certain things that were just garbage, and so I was just burning them outside. And as I was sitting there looking at that fire, I thought about a man, like Ken popped into my head, and he was all by himself already. He was angry. I didn't necessarily know how. I hadn't intended for him to be sharing the house with dead people. I intended him to be sharing the house by himself, but the story required things that were different than my intentions. So I just had to follow the story where it went.
Interesting. So when Ken first popped into your head, what was your intention and how far did the story veer?
Well, my first intention was just to have him purging out a lot of old documents and dealing with the fact that he was just getting divorced. It was just a simple divorce. And eventually my thought was that he would most likely, and it's funny but true, I didn't know for sure if he was going to burn the house down intentionally or if the house was going to burn down accidentally and he would rejoice in that happy accident. But either way, it just obviously from in the story, he doesn't burn the house down, or at least not that we know. And right. He winds up having a dead wife instead of just a divorced wife. So, things definitely veered. Things went a little sideways.
Yeah. Yeah. So what challenges did you find as you were writing this story with having Ken alone with his thoughts and this house? Were you surprised by anything that came up as you were writing?
I was the biggest challenge was keeping him interesting. because one person by himself is, as you mentioned during during the rewriting process, that it just wasn't interesting enough. And you're spot on with that. So I had to look for what else he was doing, and keep in mind that if it's not moving, there's no point in talking about it. It's a happy picnic doesn't make a story. If it doesn't have the ants, it doesn't matter. So the ants have to show up. The ants had to show up, and that meant, problems with the fire, problems with everything else.
Mm-hmm.
I just had to find that way to it.
Yeah, and it's interesting that all of the obstacles that he confronts are the ants that show up are of his own making. There are moments when it almost feels like a comedy of errors, except we aren't in a comedy. we're in a very dark story. But even just blowing the alcohol on the fire, he puts out his lighter. It's just sort of one thing after another. Do you find this story to be humorous?
In a dark sort of way, yes, I do. I've always gravitated towards darker stories, and like you said, it is absolutely a comedy of errors. But even comedies, in the Greek sense, were not all that funny. It was generally a fool, and that fool just continued to be his own fool and trip himself up. Mm-hmm. With that in mind, I tried to make sure that everything that went wrong in his path was his own fault as could be managed. Because I didn't want it to seem like, the universe was messing with him. This was Ken being stupid and getting his just desserts.
Yes. Yeah. And he absolutely does in this story. He also is drunk, which you write very well. I mean, that was something that struck me as I think it's challenging to write a character who's not in his right mind, because you have to convey this to the reader through the actions, but also, if it's a point of view character, through whatever interiority you use. And like when he says should have used a sippy cup to the empty house, and then he laughs, I was like, oh yeah, that's totally a drunk person. Any particular challenges or fun had in writing Ken?
Like years and years of study.
Yes, of course.
A lot of documentation. There was it was the only challenge with writing a drunk person in my mind is making sure they're not a comic book character, that it's not too much. A caricature, that's the word I was looking for. I don't want them to be a caricature of a drunk person. And as far as the laughing at his own joke in an empty house, that's something I do anyway when I'm sober. So I figure if I would do it sober, a drunk person would absolutely do it.
So true. Yeah. Yes. And he doesn't come off as a caricature. He does walk that fine line between being, he could go off in the direction of being ridiculous, and he doesn't. And yet he is clearly the fool. He is clearly drunk. He's also out of his head with rage and disappointment. And do you think he's relatable or likable at all?
I think that he is relatable, and to a certain degree, I actually think he is likable, because he's not that far off from what many of us could be. But when it's all said and done, I would like to think that the majority of us wouldn't make the same decisions he made. But it's not impossible to imagine ourselves in a position where we have to make decisions that, not the ones he made, but similar decisions. Bad things just happen. Mm-hmm. And
Yeah, I think that comes through when he thinks about taking care of Gina's body, and he pauses and reflects on that, like, oh, I don't think I'm a bad person, but look at how practical I'm being right now. Just gonna throw the wife's body into that hole I dug. Yes. The story has a Poe quality to it. Are you a fan of Edgar Allan Poe?
Yes, absolutely. My parents raised us with there were seven of us with a very crowded house, and they raised us with a lot of literature around. And my dad would read a regular kid's story like it was a scary story. One of the worst nightmares of my life was him reading a story where the antagonist was a cat's tail. It's a very playful story, but he did a good job of terrifying a child. And and to that end, he would sometimes read us Edgar Allan Poe, and he worked a lot of midnights, so he would make videos of him reading stories to us. And like he read The Raven to us. He loves The Raven. And through The Raven, I discovered some of Poe's short stories, which I consider to be much more masterful than any of his poetry. Though his poetry does have a delightful lyric quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A few Poesque things that struck me as I was reading this story is that as with some of Poe's characters, our protagonist is mad. He's out of his head. In this case, it's not insanity, maybe temporary insanity with the anger and the alcoholism and the black cat and the telltale heart came to mind because our hero could get away with it if he just stopped a little sooner, if he just didn't keep taking that one more step. And then, it's the little things that are his undoing. Like he puts the cat in the wall. Oops.
Right.
and then the wife's body is discovered. Or, the telltale heart it's his madness, but you use a watch and a shoelace as Ken's ultimate downfall. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of Ken's journey and how you chose to make these things like the lighter and the fireplace flue and the watch and the shoelace and the shovel his obstacles?
Unfortunately, I would love to take full credit for all of these things, but most of them just fell out organically as the story was going. And like I imagined the person falling into the hole, and when I did, as I imagined it, his leg was stuck up in the air. I'm like, well, why would his leg stick up in the air? Because the shoelace on the watch. The lighter was just a lighter. Everything that seems really, really smart was just my subconscious, my underbrain. Those guys really know what they're doing, and I try to get out of their way sometimes and just let them. They shove the story up to the top, and I try to put it out, and that's where most of those decisions came from. I can't think of a single one that you brought up that was an intentional crafted choice. It was already there before I started to craft.
I think some of the best writing happens that way. We get out of our own way and we let the story come through us. And so your subconscious was just making sure the ants came to the picnic.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. And you reference Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 in the radio flyer with the mums carefully removed. I love that detail. It held a well-worn box marked file 451. Who are your literary influences?
First and foremost, I would definitely have to say Stephen King, because again, having a love for dark stories, he's a wellspring of them. So it can't be any. There's no reason to think that I wouldn't like Stephen King, and you'd be absolutely right if you guessed that. Bradbury also, like his tales of the weird they're just delightfully done. There's no word out of place. There's not one single word too many, not one single word too few. I could read them for hours. And again, Poe, like King, Bradbury, and Poe in particular are the three strongest influences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, nice. That comes through in this story, like in a beautiful way, in a really nice way. I also enjoyed how you used such a close third point of view, but your narrator didn't suffer for it. You had a clear narrative voice while we were definitely in Ken's perspective the whole time through this story. And I think one of the things that really gives the story so much life is that while he's cleaning up after his broken marriage, his wife's infidelity, and these murders, or one murder, one accident, he's remembering times in his marriage that were good, maybe even happy. And this idea to spit the Everclear on the flames is connected to his honeymoon and a long lovemaking session with his wife. I think that's one of the things that makes him relatable, that even in our darkest moments at the end of a relationship, there were good times, right? There was something that connected us to this person. We only see Gina through Ken's eyes. The narrator never pulls back to reveal anything about her or the way Ken treated her or their marriage. Do you think this story could have been told with a different lens, or with the narrator perhaps bringing some other perspective to bear on Gina, Ken, and their marriage? Or would we lose it?
I think that if we were to look at it from a little bit further back to see more of what Gina saw in Ken, we might find that he's a little less likable than we would than what you're led to believe or led to just accept on the page. And because of that, I wanted him to be a character that people could appreciate and could see themselves, not necessarily as a reader insert, but someone who they could at least say, I know a guy like that. And if you knew that a person committed murder, you probably wouldn't hang out with that person. I would like to think that. I tend to want to think the best of humanity in general, and I don't think that the reader would appreciate a story about Ken. It wouldn't. None of the funnier parts of his failures would be funny. It would just be like, yeah, eat it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I hope he falls hard.
Yes. Yeah. And he does fall hard. Did you know that was going to be his ending from the very beginning of the story? Was he always heading toward being, crushed in a grave he had dug for someone else?
No, that was the third ending, was him being crushed in the grave. Well, actually, no, the second ending it was him. I had come up with this elaborate engineering scheme where he had the dirt piled up and he tripped into the hole and fell in with the dirt crushing down on top of him. And I realized that I didn't have the time to actually engineer that hole, let alone write about it. So I opted to keep it simple. Yeah, the KISS. It's good advice. It's good advice.
It is. It is good advice. Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing this story with us at the reading series. Is there somewhere our listeners can find you on social media or a website?
I have a Facebook page. It's Chris Hasara Words and Music. I'm fairly new to actually trying to get my work out into the public. So that's about the only place. Or if you're interested in watching me sing, they could go to, I have a YouTube channel. It's just Chris Hasara. And you can find me like my recordings of singing the national anthem, different places, or other songs that I've written.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the reading series and sharing Housekeeping with us.
Thank you for having me. It was great fun and a great pleasure.